My name is Aaron Wolf, and I am a senior in the College of Arts and Sciences studying philosophy. I'm going to be talking a little bit about at least a section of my thesis, which is on John Stuart Mill's moral and political philosophy. Specifically, I'm going to be comparing John Stuart Mill's views about the possibility of moral progress with those of the 20th century moral philosopher Bernard Williams. And then I will try and defend briefly Mill's views of moral progress against those of Williams. Now, John Stuart Mill was a 19th century British economist, psychologist, political scientist, activist, public moralist, politician. He really checked off a lot of the boxes. Among all these things and others too, he was one of the main proponents of a moral philosophy called utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill believed that when trying to deliberate about what our moral principles should be, we were in the realm of ultimate action, of ultimate ends. And when thinking about ultimate ends, what we were basically asking is, what is it ultimately desirable for people to pursue? To figure out what is desirable, Mill says we need to draw an analogy with the visible and the audible. How do we discover what is visible? We discover what is visible by seeing what people can actually see. Similarly, we discover what is audible by seeing what people can actually hear, or becoming aware of what people can actually hear. So too, we become aware of what is desirable by looking at what people ultimately desire. And according to Mill, what people ultimately desire is pleasure and freedom from pain. And this constitutes what he calls happiness. That's what he means when he says happiness. Now, if the individual's happiness is a good for the individual, then the happiness of the aggregate must be a good for the aggregate. From this, Mill derives what he calls the greatest happiness principle. It means that society should be ordered in such a way as to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, in the framework of this utilitarian moral philosophy, it becomes very easy to have a view of moral progress. For Mill, for example, one of the great sources of unhappiness in his day was the fact that women were barred from many professions and had limited property rights. Now, Mill thought that by giving women more expansive property rights and opening up many professions to their talents, he could greatly increase the happiness in society. So, a society in which women have access to more expanded property rights and can enter into whatever professions they choose to is a happier society than a society in which they can't, and therefore it's also a morally superior society. And a way in which to judge moral progress is to look at the changes in our institutions, laws, practices, and moral principles, and if those changes are more conducive to the greatest happiness than the previous state of all those things, then we can say that we have made moral progress. The 20th century philosopher Bernard Williams tries to offer an alternate view of what people really desire that poses a significant challenge to Mill's views of moral progress. Williams says people don't ultimately desire pleasure. People ultimately desire other things besides pleasure. So, for example, Williams asks, why do people want to live? Why do they want to go on? What propels them into the future? Rather than, why do some people have like a sense of meaninglessness, of lack of purpose and direction, which can sometimes make them feel as though they have no reason to live? And Williams says that we have certain categorical projects or categorical desires and projects in light of which we see life as worth living to begin with. So, for example, Anna Karenina from Leo Tolstoy's, the titular character from Leo Tolstoy's great novel, sees her romance with Vronsky as a reason for her to live. And once she begins to doubt whether or not Vronsky truly loves her, she begins to lose any sense of why she should continue living, and she grows suicidal. Now, Williams does not think that you have to have only like one categorical project or desire. And in fact, Anna's crisis is partially that she only has this one categorical project, one categorical desire. You can have multiple different projects and desires in light of which you think that life is worth living, and a healthy and happy person will have such things. But this person's happiness will be dependent on the particular desires and particular projects that he or she has. They will not be dependent on the satisfaction of pleasure as such, of pleasure in general. So, for example, the great early 20th century, late 19th century Jewish essayist, Echad Ha'am, wanted to revive create Jewish secular culture. And he saw this as a project that gave his life meaning, purpose, and direction. Now, Echad Ha'am did not simply want people to be happier. He simply didn't want a society in which everyone was happier than they were in his day, although certainly he did want that. But he also wanted a society in which there was a flourishing secular Jewish culture. And so, for Echad Ha'am, if society in the future was happier in all sorts of ways than people in his day were, but the Jewish culture he tried to create failed to materialize, it would be very hard for him to see that as progress. Because what he ultimately cared about did not come about. It did not. His project did not come to fruition. So, suppose that many people in society have these categorical projects and desires, and not all these categorical projects and desires are for various nationalist projects. Some of them could be, dedication to a literary movement, or dedication to a particular social movement, or just, trying to pursue a certain understanding of happiness for oneself and one's family. If a society in the future is happy in some way, but does not reflect these categorical projects, then it will be very hard for the people living now to look at that future society and say, wow, that society has made progress over our society. And so, for Williams, this becomes the foundation of a certain type of relativism. It becomes impossible to talk about moral progress from one society to the next. Because the categorical projects, the reasons why people care about pleasure and pain to begin with, because the reasons why they care about living to begin with, vary from society to society, and it's very hard for one society to relate to another society's set of categorical projects. Now, Mill's response to Williams could be something along the lines of this. Mill, in psychology, defended a position known as associationalism. Mill thought that the way in which we develop our categorical desires and projects, in other words, the way in which we develop a sense of what is important to us in life, and that we come to desire, and the way in which we come to desire things that are not simply pleasure, is by associating certain ideas or ideals with pleasure in the first place. In other words, if I propound a set of political ideals, then I'll come to and I'm praised for propounding that set of ideals. I'll come to associate those ideals with pleasure, and eventually I'll come to value those ideals for themselves. But what I ultimately desired was not those ideals, but pleasure. So for instance, Echad Ha'am, when he was young, grew up in a religious Jewish household, and though he came to leave his youthful faith, he still was deeply attached to Jewish culture, because he associated it with the pleasures of his youth. But, Mill says, once you become aware of the contingent process through which you came to value whatever it is you value in the first place, by which you arrived at your categorical project or desire, it weakens your attachment to the categorical project or desire. Reflection destroys attachment. Because when you become aware of the contingency, you think, I could have valued something else. Why don't I value that thing? Now, for Mill then, if we're going to maintain any sense of purpose or direction in life, we need something to hold on to, something that reflection can't destroy. And for Mill, what reflection can't destroy is just that, our desire of pleasure. Now, Therefore, pleasure for Mill becomes what he calls a permanent interest. That even as society changes and we reflect on where our categorical projects came from, we can't help but desire pleasure. And for Mill, this doesn't simply just mean the animalistic pleasures. Mill thinks that we do need the higher pleasures. We do need like moral and political and social ideals because these help create a sense, because happiness without these things is impossible for human beings, while it may be possible for animals. So while we do need moral and political and social ideals, the particular content of those ideals is always going to be merely the product of association, and therefore liable to be weakened by reflection. But because the only thing that isn't liable to be weakened by reflection is our desire for pleasure as such, it seems as though a viable set of moral and political ideals that won't be weakened by reflection will be a set of moral and political ideals that aim to further our permanent interests and not just some particular social project. Utilitarianism for Mill is that that set of higher moral and political ideals which aims to further not just a particular political project like Jewish nationalism, but our permanent interests as human beings, namely the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And therefore, it forms a viable philosophy of progress that can survive reflection and point a way forward for humanity. Thank you very much.